Welcome to an event brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the University of Cambridge, and Our Lady. My name is Clemens Sedmak, and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to this inspiring event. Rory Finnin just said it's amazing that you are here. The weather is beautiful outside, but this will be food for soul and mind. Many thanks for being here. I'm grateful to be able to welcome two special guests. We are happy to welcome Christina Warner, Director of Ukrainian Initiatives from the Temati Foundation. Welcome, Christina. We are privileged to acknowledge the presence of our founding benefactor, Dr. Bob Nanovic, who came all the way. Welcome, Bob. And then, of course, be prepared, a very special welcome to the star of the event, our speaker, Professor Rory Finnin. Welcome, Rory. If I were asked to write a school essay on the question, what have you done this week on Wednesday, September 24th? I would say the following. On Wednesday, September 24th, I found myself in the company of Rory Finnin in the Ukrainian Institute of America at Fifth Avenue in New York City. Rory was taking a day trip, as one does, to inspire the First Lady of Ukraine with his presence and wisdom. Rory was like the one who lit up the room. Everybody knew Rory and needed talking time with him. He never made it to the reception, as he was held up by conversation partners in the hallway. He fed the curiosity of many, but left the party hungry. But it was a great day. I should also mention that Wednesday was the day when the University of Notre Dame officially joined the Global Coalition of Ukrainian Studies. Rory is professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, where he built Ukrainian studies from scratch. He's also the recipient of the 2024 Laura Shannon Prize for his book, Blood of Others, which increased the prestige of the prize even further. Rory grew up at the birthplace of aviation, or rather, Wilbur and Orville Wright started to experiment with flying at what is now the birthplace of Rory Finnin. Having been trained by Jesuits in his high school and as an undergraduate at Georgetown University, Rory brings the culture of discernment with him to Notre Dame. And we are grateful that he discerned where to spend his research leave and decided to come to the University of Notre Dame. Rory is with us here at the Institute for this academic year, together with his lovely family, wife Anne, and son Shane. There are many things I find inspiring about Rory Finnin. One is his concern, commitment, and care for the cause. In an article published in 2024 in the Slavic Review, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Rory writes, I quote, "Working in the field of Ukrainian studies today is akin to trying to speak when you need to scream. It is to experience grief, guilt, and rage brought on by seeing colleagues and students killed for who they are, while you sit in your quaint Cambridge office. It is to encounter everyday heroism and sacrifice amid unimaginable extremes, while you moderate your words in the pursuit of sufficient academic objectivity." End of quote. We're inspired by Rory's position beyond impartiality for his deep care about the people he learns from and writes about. Today's topic brings together the reality of a nuclear disaster, the history of the collapse of a totalitarian regime, the current unprovoked aggression against a sovereign nation, and Our Lady. One last word about the choreography of our time together. This is a 1-hour event, 56 minutes actually. Rory will speak for about 49 minutes and 22 seconds, and then we may or may not have time for one or two brilliant, benevolent, and brain questions. If there's no time for questions, not to worry, we will end with a cake reception just outside of this beautiful room, which is, I hasten to add, the Elizabeth Nanovic Seminar Room. Rory, many thanks. The floor is yours.
Every time Clemens introduces me, I feel like I can just go away and retire because it's such a lovely experience. And truly, it's such a pleasure and a privilege not only to visit the Nanovic Institute for one day or for 1 week, but to visit with you for the entire year, to get to know the entire Keough community, I want to thank you all for being out here today. As I said, it is such a beautiful day outside. And if it weren't for the PowerPoint presentation, I'd say, let's go out there and sit and chat together. But sadly, we can't do that. It's also a great honor to stand at this podium and recognize the generosity, the leadership, the vision of Mr. Nanovic. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm really grateful for your vision of European studies at Notre Dame, and particularly your support of Ukraine and Ukrainian studies at this pivotal time. I think Notre Dame is becoming a game changer in this space, and it's really a privilege to see it, witness it, be a part of it. Before we begin, I do want to speak to you about someone else I deeply admire. Recently, I had the honor of joining an advocacy initiative that's sponsored by the mission of the president of Ukraine in Crimea, which is, as you know, been under Russian occupation since 2014. And this initiative has connected me to a colleague named Volodymyr Ananyev, who is Russia's oldest Ukrainian political prisoner. He's in his mid-70s. As a child, he grew up in Crimea. In fact, his mother is buried there in the eastern city of Kerch. He eventually moved to Kyiv, where he became a journalist, a public activist, a churchgoer, someone who connected to so many different ethnicities across Ukraine, in particular the predominantly Sunni Muslim Crimean Tatars, or Krymli. Last year, in 2024, Volodymyr traveled to Crimea, which is a risky thing to do when you're a Ukrainian citizen, given this brutal Russian occupation. But again, he's in his mid-70s. He wanted to pay respects at his mother's final resting place, connect with childhood friends. But in February of 2024, he was pulled out of a friend's home and arrested for being a part of an assassination attempt and charged with terrorism. Now, the charges are clearly absurd, and that's precisely the point. It's the Kremlin's exercise, a performance of arbitrary cruelty against a vulnerable citizen. Volodymyr is afflicted with knee pain. He can hardly walk without a cane. He has glaucoma in one eye. He needs a plethora of medication. So his arrest and unlawful detention is akin to a death sentence. And the Kremlin really relies on our silence here. The Kremlin wants us to be quiet and to make these political prisoners anonymous and faceless. So I ask you just to know his name, to share his story with one other person. If we all do that, we can break this silence and call attention to people like Volodymyr Ananyev. Thank you for that. Now, I have been really privileged to visit Notre Dame now 3 times and to speak to all of you. And it's a real privilege, as I said. And last year, when I first came, I really wanted to explain to both European history and European security the profound importance of Crimea, why we need to pay attention to Crimea. And I wanted to share stories of local resistance to Russian occupation, particularly among the Crimean Tatar people. Earlier this year, I also discussed the epical poetry, the epical intervention, artistically, politically, of Taras Shevchenko, whose poetry represents Ukraine's source code, a kind of cultural algorithm that strives in pursuit of human, national, and universal freedom. This is a man who quite literally changed the map of Europe with his words, and it's high time all of us in the context of European studies really get to know him. So at the heart of these presentations has been an intellectual conviction, and it is pretty simple. And it is that the humanities matter in discussions of policy, that a focus on culture and language always avails us of the possibility of deep policy insight. Mainstream international theorists, for instance, may think that Crimea is surely lost for good, as one pundit put it in the New York Times. But when we pay attention to local grassroots activism right now in Crimea, when we see graffiti and we see clandestine poetry flash mobs, we break apart this really self-assured picture. Analysts and politicians marvel, understandably, at the resilience of the Ukrainian people in the midst of this aggression from the Russian Federation. But reading Ukrainian poetry teaches us that while we should never take for granted Ukraine's anti-autocratic impulse, its own resilience, we shouldn't be surprised by it at all. And here at the Keough School, we'll get down to research in the concept of integral human development, in the idea of the promotion of the whole person, of the dignity of the whole person. And I think this refreshing emphasis on holism, on human flourishing, on the multidimensionality of human experience, on what Pope Paul VI used to refer to by ways of the words totus and omnis. This emphasis on integral human development makes interdisciplinary demands on us. It makes interdisciplinary demands on us. It calls on us to be intellectually holistic, academically multidimensional, at least to the extent we can be. So to understand economics, politics with depth and historical breadth, to try to forecast and diagnose accurately in the realm of global affairs, we need to incorporate and take seriously the dynamics of language, culture, the aesthetic, and in fact, faith as well, and vice versa. So this third presentation today has a similar agenda, this time with a focus on the late Soviet period. And this time with a finer point that the study of culture, and in this case, Ukrainian culture, is fundamental to our understanding of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I want to explore just one angle to this dynamic, one itinerary that hopefully will bring us from history to culture and then to politics and then back again. But first I did this the first time I came here as a Catholic schoolboy. I need to make a confession. And the confession is that before 2008, I used to despise the use of the term post-Soviet. I used to regret this excessive reliance we had on talking about a diverse part of the world by way of the Soviet Union and the Soviet inheritance and the Cold War. All of this really dominated our intellectual framing of a very complex and dynamic part of the world. A part of the world that was increasingly led by younger generations without much connection and influence, or rather influence from the Soviet Union in their lives. My friends in graduate school, in fact, used to be quite amused when I would get worked up and frustrated by the casual use of the term post-Soviet that you still see in our headlines to this day in 2024, many decades after the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think my concern was that this term kind of kept us stuck in the past. It didn't show us a new way forward. We didn't come up with new classifications, new terminologies to explain this really unique, emerging, and exciting part of the world. But the escalations of Russian aggression in Georgia and in Ukraine taught me that I was really naive. I came to realize that we have needed to talk about the Soviet Union because we had poorly understood it here in the United States, and I would say in the West, for too long. For one, we tended to conflate the Soviet Union with Russia. We would conflate the Red Army with the Russian army. This is a very stubborn problem in many countries in Europe, including Germany, which always risks effacing the role of 7 million Ukrainians in the fight against Nazism on the Eastern Front, in the liberation of the concentration camps. Ukrainians get looked past, and that's a huge problem. And currently, for our present moment, we have ignored the Soviet Union's dual existence as an ideological creature, this experiment in world communism, and as an imperial creature, particularly after the 1930s, an expansionist, chauvinistic, Russifying state. And Vladimir Putin actually cues us the importance of this duality of the Soviet Union all the time, but we tend not to let the message wash over us, as it were. I want to just take two comments as an example, one from 2005, the other from 2022, which help make clear just how consistent and clear this internal logic has been in the Kremlin. So in 2005, Putin described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the krupneyshaya geopoliticheskaya katastrofa, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The remark made a lot of news back then in 2005, but we really didn't understand what he meant. But his meaning comes into relief when we place it alongside remarks like this one. Modern Ukraine was entirely created by Bolshevik communist Russia. Soviet Ukraine is the result of the Bolsheviks' policy and can rightfully be called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its creator and architect. Of course, this comment is disingenuous, inaccurate. We don't need to get into that here. What I want to point to is how Putin has been making clear for a very long time that in his view, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was not the collapse of the Soviet Union as an ideological creature. As you can see here, he has no nostalgia, no love for Lenin, the Bolsheviks, communism. Rather, Putin has been making clear that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in his view was the collapse of the Soviet Union as an imperial creature. He lamented, regretted its loss of direct substantive control over Kiev, Tbilisi, Vilnius, etc. And Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, it needs to be said time and time again because we're normalizing this and it's a problem. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is part of a broader neo-imperial war to reassert this control and undermine the global order that weakened it in the first place. And there's another key misunderstanding of the Soviet Union that lingers today, one that brings us to a discussion of the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe of 1986. The problem is that we still struggle to understand really two things. Number one, the Soviet Union was organized and structured as a union of Soviet socialist national republics, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Kazakh, Uzbek, Tajik, etc. And number two, this organization was not cosmetic. It was not window dressing. It was a very condition of its existence. Putin really, really preys on our ignorance here. The Soviet Union as we knew it would not have been possible without the defeat, the appropriation, co-optation of various national movements that emerged in 1917, 1918, 1990, movements that manifested in Ukraine in the Ukrainska Narodna Respublika, the Ukrainian People's Republic, which declared its existence in this document in 1917. This is called the Tretyi Universal, the third universal. The term universal is from the Cossack period. It is a remarkable document that, as you can see here, features 4 languages. Can you identify them? You can just shout them out. Hebrew. Yiddish. The first time Yiddish had been used in any kind of official political document. Very good. Yiddish. Polish. Excellent. Russian. And of course, Ukrainian. Right. A remarkable document. Why is it remarkable? First of all, I'm sure many of you haven't seen it before. If you're not Ukrainian, you probably haven't seen it. I certainly never saw it as a student. This is a remarkable document I used to hear about. This declaration of the birth of the Ukrainian People's Republic in 4 different languages, which shows us something about Ukraine. It shows us that it was foregrounding political Ukraine's embrace of diversity. It was foregrounding the way in which Ukrainian elites were embracing the idea of multi-ethnicity, multi-confessional communities and society for their state. So this brings us to a shameless plug, because these kinds of things would be discussed in a course of organizing for this spring called Soviet Empire, Ukraine, Cultural Imperialism, the Red Century. So all of you can come and join. It would be great to see you there. Okay, so what's the problem? I'm simplifying the picture, but on the whole, our academic discussion of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 has revolved around the spatial metaphor of core and periphery. Some scholars argue that a protracted a protracted crisis in the Kremlin and in the Kremlin leadership in the midst of various policies of reform, we know them by the terms perestroika or perebudova in Ukrainian, glasnost, for instance, that these policies precipitated in the core a collapse. Other scholars see these resurgent national movements along the periphery as catalysts for the fall. The reality is, of course, somewhere in between. But where is the between in this metaphorical space of core and periphery? And so here the metaphor begins to let us down, which is, I think, why we need to shift gears and try another approach. And in fact, for us to adopt a simple mantra that any discussion of Soviet breakup should trigger a discussion of Soviet makeup. And that makeup, as you can see here, is determined by the borders of these national republics, which 15 of them in total in 1991 break apart more or less along these lines precisely when the Soviet Union breaks apart. And so here, I think it's really helpful to employ another metaphor, one from the material sciences. I don't know if there are any mosaicists. We'll return to mosaics fairly soon in this talk, but if there are any mosaic artists in the room, you will have seen them do something unique with ceramic tile, say, to create a new form, a new shape, they'll take a knife, a scalpel, and they'll press a small fissure into the surface of the material. The fissure can be evident, sometimes it's not. But the most important thing is that fissure doesn't cause any decay of the actual substance until you press and apply tensile force across the fissure. And then when you do that, it breaks apart perfectly, creating a new shape, a new object with its own contours and form. And the point here is that these small fissures, which really don't make much of a difference under normal circumstances, have significant influence over structural strength under extraordinary conditions. And I make this digression just to underscore a simple point, that the Soviet Union did not implode, it didn't explode, it didn't shatter. The national scoring of the Soviet Union, as it were, made sure of it. It rather broke apart along meaningful lines of its own design. And without acknowledging or understanding the instrumental role of this scoring, and without taking seriously the application of pressure across these fissures, so not only between Moscow and Kiev, but somewhere in between, then the end of the Soviet Union can appear a mystery, or as it was for many policymakers and politicians, it can appear a surprise. So the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe placed enormous pressure on this Soviet mosaic. And it was a part of, let's say, the tensile force, the pressure that caused the Soviet Union to collapse and snap along national lines. And so what I'd like to do is focus on its cultural aftermath, which actually defied odds to gesture past trauma, to gesture past catastrophe, to new horizons of hope and beauty. And these horizons, in fact, are very much a part of the landscape of contemporary Ukraine as it resists Russian aggression. And the figure guiding this journey from catastrophe and hope, most frequently in Ukrainian culture, is at the heart of this university, which is why I wanted to bring this material to you today. And that figure is, of course, Mary. In Ukraine, a confounding, polyphonic, fraught, and at times darkly humorous Marian vision becomes central in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster. It becomes a force of really fraught emotionality and creative agency that indeed contributes to the breakup of the Soviet Union and to the makeup of a new independent Ukrainian state. So what I'd like to do is structure our discussion along the lines of three different themes. The first is silence. The second is speech. The third, salvation. Chernobyl was not only an event of traumatic significance with symbolic fallout, as the literary scholar Tamara Hunderova puts it. It was also a war of silences. And here I have in mind the work of the Yale historian Jay Winter, a really trenchant and searching scholar of the First World War. He identifies a number of domains of silence that emerge in the wake of war and calamity. Among them, liturgical silence, what he calls liturgical silence, which gestures to the ineffable, to the divine, to the question of good and evil. And the second is political silence. Political silence of elites, which often denies reality, which poses alternative facts, for instance. And in the cultural afterlife of the Chernobyl disaster, we see a collision and a conflict between these two silences, between the shock of the ineffable and the initial and very craven, cowardly inaction and ineptitude of Soviet political elites who did not announce and intervene quickly enough to save the lives of thousands of citizens. And as you can see here, this question of Soviet elite silence became a headline in our own journalistic publications weeks after the catastrophe. So liturgical silence marks a space beyond the limits of our perception. It's beyond the reach of human consciousness itself. As the philosopher Paul Virilio once told the Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, the main victim of Chernobyl was consciousness. The disaster was a perfect storm of malfunction, hubris, bad luck, that actually started very paradoxically as a safety check on reactor 4. The check was simply trying to see whether the turbines could keep spinning with a loss of electricity. Could it generate power, even if power is taken away? And I think for those of you who are interested in reading more about this, I highly recommend our wonderful colleague Sergei Plokhy's book on this. The upshot is that this catastrophe is the result of really two things. One is faulty design, cost-cutting measures that led to a great crisis at the plant, and then hubris on the part of various engineers. But why is silence such a prominent feature of Ukrainian culture after this catastrophe in 1986? The event really does strain comprehension because our very sense of cause and effect of time and space become vulnerable when we think about it. Humankind has long come to know and fear the sublime, the awesome power of the natural world. But how do we understand a man-made disaster that harnesses nature at the atomic level and inverts it against us with dire consequences, not for a lifetime or a generation, but for an entire epoch? How do we process a cataclysm that released at least 50 million curies of radiation into the atmosphere, covering virtually half of the European continent? By one count, the equivalent of 270 Hiroshima explosions. A cataclysm that contributed to the deaths of thousands and will indeed affect the health of Ukrainians, Belarusians, citizens in both of these countries and beyond for generations and even centuries to come. A cataclysm that saw 65 settlements rendered unlivable by contamination in a highly radioactive 30-kilometer exclusion zone, which today is this really eerie nature reserve with hundreds of varieties of elk, wolves, boars, etc. So the awesome silence that is prompted by such big questions haunts a really large corpus of documentary films that are made by Soviet Ukrainian studios after the disaster. Studios like the Dovzhenko studio, which is very famous. Also another studio, more academic in nature, Ukr Kino Kronika. These films were made by a number of different figures, but the two most pivotal are Roland Syryenko and Volodymyr Shevchenko. They produced uncompromising exposés of the Chernobyl disaster. And these are works that really use the observational mode with intermittent interviews to explore, first of all, what happened, to herald and applaud those who sacrificed themselves, the so-called liquidators, which is a term when you hear it, you think it's, a very negative role, but actually a very positive one. These were men and women who liquidated the effects of the catastrophe. And also these films work to shame Soviet elites who denied that this catastrophe occurred, assembled, and they outright deserted a vulnerable population. In the film Porny, or Threshold, this is a film that was actually first screened at an international documentary film festival in Leningrad in 1988, and then it was very quickly pulled from circulation, and you can see why. Syryenko incorporates really striking film of the town of Pripyat, which is about 2 kilometers away from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the distance effectively from here to the main building and back again. In a key sequence I'm about to show you, Syryenko charts narrative arc, beginning with shots of everyday life, of parents pushing their children in strollers, of happy weddings, completely unaware of the contamination surrounding them. And then you see the sudden introduction of a tank, a pulled focus on the plant itself, a menacing note of music, and then finally an encounter of a civilian man who approaches two authorities who are in complete contamination gear, wearing protective gear, and giving no answers to him, as you'll see. This is a scene with no voiceover, there are no explanations. There's only silence of that which everybody, in which no one speaks what everyone knows. As the sequence builds, pay attention, by the way, to the film as a technical artifact. I'll be asking a question after, and I really want to know what strikes you as strange about it. would take the Soviet regime days to evacuate Pripyat even after this was shot. This was shot just hours after the explosion of the fourth reactor. For those of you who are paying attention to the surface of the film, this technical aspect, what did you see? What was strange about it? Yeah, the blinking, the flashes, those are actually evidence of the effect of the radiation itself on the celluloid. And Serhienko, the director, doesn't discuss this. He's motivated again by silence here. But his compatriot, Volodymyr Shevchenko, does call attention to the screen as a surface of infection. This is just a few seconds. He does this in a film called Chernobyl, a Chronicle of Trying Weeks. This is aerial footage from May 1986, where when you look towards the bottom left, in the foreground, you'll see the gaping reactor number 4. And the narrator here explains that in the process of editing this video, certain colleagues thought that the film stock was defective. But as the narrator says, there is no defect, that this is actually evidence of radiation affecting the film stock. It is, quote, the visible face of radiation, unquote.
На екрані один з кадрів, який технічний контроль попервах затримав як брак. То не брак. Це зримий лик радіації. Дивіться.
The filmmaker here shot over 20,000 meters of film in this project, something like 660 hours. The film obviously had to be heavily edited, and it was eventually censored by authorities and then later released internationally, where it played and was screened in 132 different countries. It won 9 different international awards, and in 2017, UNESCO declared the film itself a cultural monument. Tragically, the filmmaker Shevchenko didn't see the film make it in these screenings abroad. He died of prolonged and excessive exposure to radiation, passing away before the final version of the film was completed. And a special Soviet commission took the first camera he used and had to bury it so deeply in the ground because it had been terribly contaminated by radiation. So these are films that explore what occurred in 1986 by way of the filmic medium through silence. And eventually, though, silence does cede some way to speech in Soviet Ukrainian culture. And the figure of Mary, Mother of God, quickly emerges as a conduit of expression and communication, a channel for mourning a catastrophe that seemed to grasp and scratch at the eternal, at the cosmic. This should come to no surprise to us. Mary is known, after all, as the Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowful mother who endures and overcomes the pain of witnessing Christ's passion and crucifixion. And in fact, weeks ago, we marked the feast day of Our Lady of Sorrows, which is the patronal feast of the Congregation of the Holy Cross that founded this great university. But keep in mind, we may expect to see Mary in these contexts, but in the Soviet Union, in official publications, for a state that espoused official atheism, this was very unusual and very strange indeed, and very risky to boot. The pronounced emphasis on Mary, I think, marked a need among Ukrainian cultural figures to attend to the transcendental nature of this calamity in both material and spiritual terms. Mary is the archetype behind the protagonist of a novel by Volodymyr Yavorivsky, who is a journalist, writer, activist. He was like Serhienko and Shevchenko, the filmmakers I just introduced you to earlier. He was there in Chernobyl, in Pripyat, to speak to a variety of actors, local party activists, citizens. And here Yavorivsky positions Mary as the matriarch of a Mirovich family, a family that goes by the surname Mirovich, a mother whose children are affected in various ways by their proximity, their work at the nuclear power plant. She is the mother of 4 sons, some of who die in this calamity, of a daughter as well. They work as a fireman in one case, as a plant designer, engineer, and so on. So she's this anchor of a very impressionistic narrative that is written with the swift pace befitting of a journalist like Yavorivsky. The novel is a really vivid picture of life in Pripyat and of the motives and aspirations of people tied to the plant. So we encounter in the novel family politics, young love, careerist aspirations, bureaucratic bungling, and the like. All of these things are really given incisive treatment in the novel. Jaworowski's focus is on people and what makes them tick. And what makes Mary tick is her love and her survival, her ability to carry on with purpose. So she returns to the contaminated village after the catastrophe. She bears the loss of her children claimed by it, and she suffers. And in her suffering, models a resilience that for the reader offers hope. But note the title of the novel, Maria with Wormwood at the End of the Century. So Wormwood, or in Ukrainian Polin, is an allusion to Revelation 8, verses 10 to 11, in which the angel blows his trumpet, causing a great star to fall from the heavens. The name of the star, we are told, is Wormwood. Again, Polin in Ukrainian, and it turns all the earth's waters bitter. So we have here an indirect link between the word Chernobyl, which actually isn't wormwood itself in Ukrainian, it's mugwort, but they're associated with each other. So we can get into botany in Ukrainian studies as well. But this implicit link between Chernobyl and the apocalypse by way of these words, and this implicit link here between Mary and the book of Revelation in Jaworowski's title really do point to a unique coloring of Ukrainian depictions of Mary after Chernobyl, particularly the Chernobyl Madonna of Ivan Drach's imagination, which positions Mary in a very daring, even radical departure from Ukrainian and Orthodox norms. So in the Orthodox context, Mary is rarely referred to as Madonna in the courtly illusion that this term implies, right? Mia donna in the Italian, my lady. In the Orthodox tradition, she's more commonly presented as a mother, the Theotokos, or God-bearer, the Bohomatir, as in this famous mosaic in St. Sophia Cathedral of the 11th century, so-called Bohomatir Oranta, or the Virgin Orans. So in the Orthodox tradition, the humanity of Mary is emphasized. The faithful are meant to approach her, particularly through icons, as a real person. At the height in the Renaissance, in visual arts, she is more often than not the figure of Madonna, one of regal nobility. She's the queen of heaven, an intercession who channels God's love, particularly when we are in pain. But Drach's Chernobyl Madonna is something else entirely. And at first, he cannot describe her. Words fail. Silence overwhelms. Я заздрю всім, у кого є слова. Немає в мене слів. Розстрілення до слова. Мовчання тяжко душу залива. Ословленість дурна і випадкова. I envy those who have words. My words are gone, executed, each one of them. Silence weighs heavily on the soul, but speech is dumb and haphazard. I think all of us who've encountered grief and try to articulate that grief understand what Drach is getting at here. So silence is afflicting him. It's doing more than that. It's actually dividing his soul from itself. Silence divides my soul from itself. Silence is my entire world, wrapped in despair, in verbal cellophane. It's a really striking metaphor. Silence, a world of silence wrapped in despair, in verbal cellophane. Why cellophane? Well, many pensioners in the exclusion zone were wrapping themselves, various items, plates, dishes, even animals in cellophane, thinking that this would protect them against radiation. So Drach is using what is a folk practice among pensioners into something highly poetic and metaphorical. So Drach's poem is an act of overcoming silence to speak of Chernobyl in a manner and on a scale commensurate with the catastrophe itself. Not only because the explosion happened to take place on Ukrainian territory, not only because it seemed to cast Ukraine as a harbinger of the end days, but also because Chernobyl, for so many Ukrainians, made tragic sense of their entire history. It illustrated the way in which Ukraine had been exploited, plundered, abandoned, abused for centuries by European colonialism, Russian imperialism. And so for Drach, it even became unexpectedly and probably uncomfortably a form of identification, because Drach himself became a fairly prominent figure in Soviet Ukrainian cultural life. He was an emissary for Soviet Ukraine around the world. And he went to India with a number of Soviet writers in the 1980s. He was touring a slum in Calcutta where he encountered the German novelist and poet Günter Grass. And one of Drach's colleagues knew Grass very well and introduced Drach to him. And his friend said to Grass, "This is Ivan Drach, poet, Ukraine." And Günter Grass responded looking kind of quizzical, not really putting it together where Ukraine was. Drach's friend noticed this, rephrased the introduction and said, "This is Ivan Drach, poet, Chernobyl." And Günter Grass said, now I know where he's from. So Drach blames the Communist Party and the Kremlin for the disaster. He also connects Chernobyl to other 20th century national tragedies, from the man-made famine of 1932-33, it's called Holodomor, to the Second World War. All of these for Drach are links in a chain of oppression and unfreedom, events that exposed, to use Rob Nixon's terms, the slow violence of Russian colonialism. In his speeches, Drach even uses the term Dukhovny Chernobyl, or spiritual Chernobyl. This is a term that you see frequently used in the late 1980s as a political opposition emerges to fight for an independent, sovereign Ukraine. Drach, though, was a complicated character. His framing of this as a crime of the Kremlin wasn't straightforward, because he himself had, as I just mentioned, made some really powerful relationships at the Kremlin. He was a very promising poet who emerges in the early 1960s alongside a number of figures that we call the Shestidesiatniki, or 60ers. Those of you who know anything about this period may recognize Mikhailo Hronovsky next to him, to Drach's left, Mikhailina Kotsubinska over on the right, as well as Ivan Svetlichny. At some point in his career, Drach would disavow these colleagues. He would make connections with the Kremlin. He became something of a Soviet-friendly artist, which then led him to these different privileges that brought him to India and many other places around the world. But it's precisely because he had this cozy relationship with the Kremlin that made his pivot with Chernobyl and the Chernobyl Madonna so powerful and reached so many. In his words, Chernobyl changed everything. It shocked his conscience and shook his soul. And it taunted him in such a way that he channeled his talent for these incisive and rather strange metaphors into a new product. The product was the Chernobylska Madonna, which was initially published in the journal Vityazna in 1988, a journal called Homeland. The book has been called a poem mosaic, and it's a really fitting term. It's a highly polyphonic, polygeneric, polystylistic, put poly in front of the word, it will work, 25 different parts, written in free verse and bound loosely together by this theme of Soviet indifference, cruelty in the face of suffering, as well as ecological decline. This is when the Green Movement in Ukraine really emerges as a cultural and political force. And at the center of all of this is this eponymous Chernobyl Madonna, a very multiple, polysemous character who is a mother, a protector of the planet, called the Chore Dita, the sick child. She is also a victim, an old lady in the village who puts boots on her cow and wraps herself in cellophane. And when asked about it, she responds, "Well, haven't you read about the radiation?" So there's a kind of dark humor in the poem at times as well. She's also a version or an embodiment of a pokrytka, which is a prominent trope in 19th century Ukrainian poetry of the abandoned, covered woman, a woman alienated not only from her family, but from entire community. So in this poem, the Chernobyl Madonna is placed under this black ritual cloth, which has really pregnant allusions in Ukrainian culture. But she's also this is what is very striking to me reading this poem again. She's also a locus of horror. She's a locus of violence, akin to the cryptic woman in Revelation 12, verses 1-6. Figure often associated with Mary, a woman combatant in a cosmic confrontation with a dragon, a mother forced to flee into the desert for safety. We don't have time to read it here, but I invite you to visit the text later. It's, of course, highly emblematic of the embrace of background that we'd say the Book of Revelation occasions. This painting by Władysław Baklicki, which is inspired by Drácha's poem, evokes a sense of this cosmic confrontation, this interplay of, on one hand, Mary's power, the power of protection. She's shielding her son from these lines like swords of radiation, the right of the frame, but at the same time, her mouth is agape in horror, even looking at the promise of a budding flower underneath the sun. But underneath Drácha's complex and often dark satirical portrayal of Mary is a very dramatic intercession. And it's a dramatic transformation of Mary's own role as an intercessor. So Drácha's Chernobyl Madonna does not intervene between God and us. Mary instead intervenes inside us, through us, turning the poet himself, the lyrical persona, into a pen. This is where we see salvation emerging in this context. You tried to write about her, the Chernobyl Madonna, but she writes through you, as if you were a fragile pen, a frail quill, as if with a pencil, frantic and crazed, a gnarled pencil. Mary intercedes by coming inside you and transforming you, making you the poet as a reader as well. This metaphor is taken even further, this kind of transformative intercession. Not only does she turn you into a pen who writes this poem, but also she turns you into a baton and conducts your life like an orchestra, as you see here. When she takes you in your hand like a baton and conducts your life like an orchestra, you don't know when the violin will come in, sparkling like a child's sacred spring, or when the cymbals of deceit, boisterous and guarded, will choke on their frenzied brass. Cryptic, highly metaphorical, but here he's talking about a life as a symphony with its dark notes and its positive notes, notes that we never can anticipate fully. So Mary, in other words, becomes an integral transformative force, twisting grief, silence, and trauma into delicate hope, tentative speech, and strong defiance. At a time of panic, of a lot of fear, fire and brimstone, of ghoulish representations of the end of the world, the Chernobyl Madonna emerges amid and through images of panic, fear, and Armageddon to persist, to carry on, to bear in her arms the sick child of the world, and carry it to a place of protection. And the Ukrainian national movement seizes on this image and propels itself forward with new purpose, because as it happens, the two cultural figures in Ukraine who center Mary so prominently in the midst of the Chernobyl fallout become two of Ukraine's most instrumental political leaders in the late Soviet period. So they embody and enact this message of resilience, this confrontation with the trauma of colonialism, and they put it into action. So Ivan Drácha on the right in 1989 becomes the chair of the Narodny Ruch Ukrainy, the people or popular music of popular movement of Ukraine, rather, excuse me. And Volodymyr Yavoritsky, who wrote Maria with Wormwood at the end of the century, becomes co-chair. Drácha will say, and he says this very often in the meetings of this national movement, that the stimulus for all the democratic processes in Ukraine was indeed Chernobyl. In his words, Chernobyl destroyed our illusions and revived the green shoots of our nation. It showed us that we had approached the precipice, the abyss, and could never return. He described the Ruch movement as baptized, quote unquote, by Chernobyl and placed under the care of the Chernobyl Madonna, the mother of God of Chernobyl. Ruch was a phenomenon. it skyrocketed to public prominence in weeks, garnering members across the country and becoming Ukraine's leading oppositional party in time. And one of the most striking manifestations of its reach, its political salience, was the so-called living chain, Zhibi Landstuk, of January 1990, which joined many thousands, if not millions of Ukrainians, flag waving, as you'll see, together from Lviv in the west to Kyiv in the center of the country in the depths of winter in January. A former political prisoner activist named Raisa Rudanko once told me that she thought this chain was more of a rosary. That Marian image always stayed with me over these years. And I want to conclude with this rarely seen video of this action. One that shows us not only that the breakup of the Soviet Union is on the horizon at this time, 1990, but more importantly, that the rise of a liberal, democratic, independent Ukraine is almost inevitable. As we watch this clip, and I did leave it slightly long so you can get a sense of just how long this human chain really was, you will see singing at the end the lyrics from a popular Christmas carol in Ukraine, lyrics being, "Rejoice, O earth, the Son of God is born." We'll finish with this video. I'm happy to take a question in the 6 minute and 10 seconds we have. We're almost to the end of this clip. Remember, this is at a time without the internet, right? Without social media. The way you got your neighbors, family members to do this was to call them and was to plan and to organize. And the strength of that organization, the logistical achievement is astounding. This is January, so close enough to the Christmas holiday and the singing of this wonderful song with the lines, "Rejoice, O earth, the Son of God is born." Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did it take?
Yes, 6 minutes. We have time for anyone. Good, Professor Loden.
Thank you very much. This was, of course, very, very moving and very timely, and we should not forget about this. I have a very simple question. What can I find the text of the poem in a language so I could collect the Marie?
That's a terrific question.
He reads Latin fluently.
I wish we could translate it into Latin, Gundi. Unfortunately, it's a good question. I don't know if it's available in German. It hasn't been fully translated into English.
Oh, okay.
Which is a proposition letting students out there. It's a terrific project, an important poem, to say the least.
Thank you. Professor Taylor, thanks for the talk. I wonder if you could say something about the popular and devotional context of Mary Ukraine and whether or not that serves as a kind of context that informs or connects with the high cultural material that you talked about.
That's a great question because Marian veneration takes place in the underground. The Ukrainian Catholic Church, with its own tradition, its own very diverse representations of Mary, are active, but they're not at the center of Soviet life. The same, of course, can be said for Orthodox communities as well. So this reference you made to high culture and low culture, in this case, the low is referring to the culture of Mary in devotional spaces and in spaces of worship, in kitchens and in homes, in places that were not pronounced and not public. So the way that Drach uses Mary is in many respects bringing this vision of Mary that is from the kitchen table, that is still practiced surreptitiously in different communities, and bringing it into published official Soviet literature. So that journal, Vyshyna in 1988, is published in the Soviet Union, circulated widely, very elite journal. But again, what's strange about this move up to the realm of high culture is how strange and at times fraught and horrific this vision of Mary is. And that's I think the legacy of the book of Revelation for these figures. I'm not sure, and I did my best to see whether Drac had an experience with the book of Revelation prior to the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. I couldn't tell. But he always had this very strange metaphorical language. So his first poetic collection is called Nij u Sonce, Knife in the Sun. He had this really interesting vision. And these visions, I think, are related to the kind of idiom in the book of Revelation. So these devotional contexts are very fraught and complex depending on where you are in Ukraine, with the Ukrainian Catholic Church more active in the West, but again, mostly underground. And what Drac and Yavorivsky are doing are mainstreaming Mary again. But as they mainstream her, they complicate this traditional picture as either the Theotokos, the God-bearer, or as this suffering intercessor. There's something more complicated and slightly frightening, frankly, and surreal in these works, particularly in Drac's poem.
Thank you. Last question, very brief.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. My colleague Emily and I had taught a class where we were looking at Central Asian responses to nuclear testing and the protests around that and the way in which they intersected with the environmentalist movement. I was wondering whether, like, across these peripheries, if there was conversation across religions, languages, if there was conversation against the anti-nuclear aspects of this.
Thank you. It's a great question because one of the first reactions among these Ukrainian cultural activists is to, number one, process this as a Ukrainian tragedy, not to make it exclusive because so much of the fallout was in Belarus. So there is a lot of conversation with Belarusian cultural activists in the Asians. That's the first protocol for many of them. But as I mentioned, the fears of nuclear power, particularly nuclear power in which the design is flawed, in which cultural activists are learning about graphite rods and understanding the science behind these reactors and how the Soviet Union undercut a lot of the technology, threatening effectively the end of the world in these peripheries and across the Soviet Union. This launches a green movement that has great transnational scope. I don't know about Drac in Central Asian context, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had close conversations with them. The moment that Ruk appears in 1989, it is a catalyst for connection. At this time, so many figures across the national republics are learning from each other. They're espousing a very kind of multi-ethnic, liberal democratic philosophy that is linking them to these other communities. So I'd love to look more into that in Central Asia. It's a great question.
It's 4:29. Let's Rory.
I wanted to give a little gift to Rory. It's $41.50. It's our Christmas ornament showing Our Lady. And we want to thank you again for your wonderful talk. Thank you, everybody, that you have been here. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, your weekend, the rest of your lives, and our research. Thank you so much.